Everybody cool with back in session?
All rise.
All right, please be seated. All right.
Ms. Hornyak, I want to ask you about some general questions first about your company.
Okay,
Your company is not a laboratory, is that correct?
that's correct.
You are a software company.
Yes,
And that software that you use goes by the brand name Truealittle, is that correct?
that's correct.
And the Truealittle software that you use is not made available to any other departments for peer review, is that correct?
That's actually not correct. Recently, we have started offering on our disclosure disc a chance to review what's called the source code, or just kind of like what makes up the program. We allow experts to, an expert witness or a defense expert to, there's an invitation that they could review it under certain conditions, as well as an offer for them to test it as well, free of charge.
Let me ask you about those conditions. What conditions are those?
It would be non-disclosure agreements. There would be a fee involved. It's described in the letter, and I'm not familiar with the exact number totals.
And is that a recent development in cybergenetics?
We've been offering it since June 2017.
And your company is, I guess, a for-profit business, is that fair to say?
It's a private company.
You're not affiliated with any particular law enforcement or state agency, is that right?
That's correct.
And when these agencies send items to you, they pay you for a specific result, is that right?
That's incorrect. For prosecution, defense, police, whoever sends us DNA data, we actually offer a free screening where we will process all of those items and give them back the preliminary results, which are what we had talked about earlier, where we examine the 20-some items. And then from there, either side, whoever wants to hire us, can choose to get a formal report and then court testimony.
So in this case, these items that you were asked about, I think it was page 7 of what is your case packet, is that right?
Yes.
Those items you gave a preliminary report about, but the state chose not to pay you to do a report on those, is that right?
That's correct. They just asked us to report on the one item, the window frame, but everything is disclosed.
Everything is disclosed, but it's not a final report.
That's correct, yes.
What do you do once you make the preliminary consideration and the state says, okay, we're going to pay you to get this information now? What's the process to make it from a preliminary report to a final report? Is there further testing that is done, or is it just stamped final?
So sometimes there can be further testing, which just means either running the computer for longer to try out more possibilities. Sometimes we can say, okay, we've established, like say, for example, the victim is present as a lot of the DNA, and then we can ask the computer, okay, she's a contributor, assume her as known and solve for the other unknown contributors. Or sometimes it's just a more formal write-up, so we document the data, the match statistics, everything like that more formally to put it into that formal report. The preliminary report's just kind of a table with the approximate match statistics.
And so in this preliminary report you did regarding the other matters, there were no other matches from any of these pieces of evidence to Roy Coons?
Other than the cigarette butt, correct.
But you didn't put that in your final report that was made an exhibit for the jury?
We were not asked to report on that item.
And that would be something that the prosecution would have had to ask for?
Prosecution or defense, either side could have asked us to produce additional reports.
Assuming they were willing to pay for it?
There is a charge for the formal reports, yes.
Can you explain to the jury, just in general terms, how the calculations you did in this case work?
So the computer is it uses what's called Bayesian statistics, which just means looking at data and kind of solving and figuring out, what's going on in that data, putting those patterns, matching those patterns to that data. And then...
Let me stop you right there and just ask, as an example, maybe in a way of explanation, is it something like the game Scrabble, where you have all these letters that are mixed up and then your computer sorts those out into possible strands, like words?
Yes, it's similar to that. So instead of words, it's just trying to look at the data and figure out those pairs of alleles or what numbers kind of go together based on that data.
And so you may run your test and have one word or strand of alleles that indicates one possible match, but then your computer can re-scramble those and maybe come up with another pattern in a match. Is that fair to say?
The computer is always trying out different patterns, and then what we saw on that one slide is the probabilities, or the number of times. It's like, okay, I tried this out, so I give it this percentage of the time that it was a good explanation.
And one of the reasons that your company is used sometimes is because laboratories like the Metro Lab, Tennessee Bureau of Investigation Lab, has something called threshold standards. Is that right?
Yes, from the past. Most labs are now moving towards using computers, or it's called probabilistic genotyping. There's a couple of different softwares.
Let me stop you right there, because let's cover what a threshold height is before we get into that explanation, just so the jury understands.
Sure.
So what is a threshold height?
So a threshold height is basically a line drawn in the sand or across the data, where a laboratory says, okay, above this line, I'm going to use that data in my interpretation. Below this line, I'm not going to use it.
And why is that they draw that line?
For manual analysis, it helps to make the problem easier, as well as help them to ensure maybe that they're using good and not good data, true alleles, or alleles that are they're comfortable reporting, just looking at it by eye.
I'm sorry, go ahead. I didn't cut you off. I was going to say, isn't another word for that reliability?
For that method, yes.
So the more material you have at a certain allele, I'm thinking of it like in your diagram where there's a peak, okay, in your slideshow. So the more material there is on a certain allele number, the higher that peak will get. Is that fair to say? Is that
Yes, correct. The height of the peak corresponds to the relative amount of that allele present. So a taller peak, there's more of that allele.
And so some certified laboratories, like the Metro National Lab and TBI, for example, they may say that there's a line here, and if that peak doesn't get above that line, that's what I mean. That's what you're talking about.
Judge, I'm objecting to the formal question. It's assuming facts are not in evidence that they would not, and why they would not bring it.
Well, it's hypothetical, I presume, and she's testifying as an expert, right?
Right.
Well, I'm just asking that he asked her if that's true. It's coming across as him testifying to that.
Okay, well,
If it could be a hypothetical.
rephrase your question, okay?
So in this threshold that you've testified about, is that typically, in your experience as an expert, does that mean that in some laboratories, if that peak amount doesn't get above that threshold line that they determined is reliable versus not reliable, that they won't use that material if it's below that threshold?
That's correct. They won't use it below that threshold because for that specific method, or looking at it by eye, that's what they've deemed to be kind of their line in the sand, or what they'll use for interpretation. It doesn't mean the data is not there, they're just not using it.
And one of the reasons that data may be below the line is because it's older or degraded.
It could be, or there's just less of that specific DNA allele or that person there. It could be degraded, it could be there's just less of that person present.
If you say less of that person present, you're talking about a smaller sample size.
A smaller amount of DNA that they left behind, yes.
Let me ask you about that. So the DNA sample that was used from the windowsill that you think matches Roy Coons, what was the size of that sample that you received?
We received the electronic data from the sample. I did not receive the information about the quantitation or the amount of the DNA. The crime lab analysts would have that information, though.
So whether it was a pound of DNA or 4 cells of DNA, you don't know based on the analysis you did?
That's correct. Based on the data, there was more than 4 cells, but there was a good amount of DNA. It's just I don't know the specific number. The crime laboratory would know that.
When you say good amount, what's a good amount?
There were taller peaks, so if I could just refer to my notes real quick. Based on the report notes, we actually document the kind of the relative the heights we're seeing. So in this case, we said that there's peak heights roughly in the 200 to 2,000 RFU range, which is just those heights of those peaks. So most of the peaks were above that 200 line. So if you remember from that data, there was that scale on the left. Most of those were above 200 and between 200 and 2,000.
But where they fell on that, that wasn't something that was in your calculation because you were just using data provided you by other laboratories.
Correct.
And you would expect that those laboratories would be able to provide that information.
Yes.
But that's not something you took into consideration.
That's correct. The computer just looks at the data produced by a laboratory.
And that is partly because your laboratory is not concerned with threshold amounts.
Correct.
You're going to, if it's the tiniest amount, it shows a bump on your little mountain scale, or your peak scale, you consider that to be present at that loop.
The computer can take into account that little bump, but it'll actually consider everything. If there's actual data there, or like the baseline noise kind of a thing, or like the background noise, it can model all of that in order to come up with the different genetic types or profiles that it can separate from the data. If there's only one little bump there, it's not going to be an informative inference. There's, kind of like you put nothing in, you're not going to get anything out. It's not going to magically say, oh, this person's included.
So you mentioned on your direct examination that you ran some, did you run the test several times? Did I hear that correctly, or just one time?
We ran the program several times under different conditions, yes, to establish that we're getting a similar result every time.
And when you ran that, it was through the same computer software system every time?
Correct.
So if there was an error in that software code, you would expect to have the same result every time because what you put in is what you get out.
Well, that's why we test the method to make sure it's working as we expect. So we've tested it on samples of known composition. So we kind of know what you put in, and we see, okay, we're getting those profiles back out. And so it's just showing that the method's been tested on known data, and then so when you put in this unknown data, you can rely on those results.
Have you worked in other DNA laboratories for cybergenetics?
I have not worked in a crime laboratory. I did do my DNA research in the DNA lab at Duquesne, so in academic setting, yes.
Are you familiar with certifications of laboratories, the certification process?
Yes, they undergo what's called an accreditation, which is just kind of a evaluation of their methods. Is everything documented? Are they proficient in all their methods? And there's different categories in that.
And who are some of the major accreditation agencies?
One is called the American Society for Crime Laboratory Directors Laboratory Accreditation Board, or ASCLD Lab, just kind of the acronym for that. That's, I think, the main accrediting body in the United States.
And cybergenetics accredited by that company?
Cybergenetics is not accredited. We are a private company that we don't fall under those same standards as public laboratories. Public laboratories are accredited and fall under the FBI quality assurance guidelines as well.
So cybergenetics does not have to comply with the FBI quality assurance program?
Those are more for producing the data. There's some for interpretation, and then there's also standards or guidelines for probabilistic genotyping or the computer interpretation, which we do comply with.
Now you mentioned that there were some certifications, though, that cybergenetics does. Is that correct? You received?
Yes, they are cybergenetics designed courses to teach people about specifically the true allele system.
So cybergenetics basically certifies itself through those courses that it develops.
We offer the course and train our own analysts in-house, as well as the crime laboratories that produce or purchase the system. They can also purchase that training.
So as far as what cybergenetics does, since it's not accredited, there is no peer review of what is happening inside your computer system.
There is no accreditation of our company because it's not a public company, but the true allele system has been validated and tested and reviewed over 30 times. And testing it on data is how scientists can review a system because, you kind of know what you put in, what you kind of expect to get out. So it's like, you don't really watch how they kind of put the car together. You test drive it and you're like, okay, it drives.
Well, aren't other private labs accredited also?
Some can be. A lot of it's for producing the data so that it could then be used in court, because producing the data is the part where contamination can sometimes be an issue.
I want to ask you specifically about this case. You referenced some pages, I think page 7 we talked about, and some other things. That's not in your final report, correct?
It's not in the final report, but it is produced as part of the disclosure materials that supplement that final report.
I believe there are 134 pages in your case packet. Does that sound right if you have your copy there?
Yes, that's correct.
I have a copy of that. Can I show you this and see if this looks like the one that you have?
Sure.
This was provided by the state's case packet dated June 5th, 2019. appear to be the case packet that you prepared in this case?
Yes, it is.
I'd ask that you make the next number exhibit, please.
Okay, this case packet,
It's called Case Packet, dated June 5th, 2019.
all right. Number 9.
Ms. Hornyak, in that case packet, it appears that when you did the analysis of the DNA presumably taken from the windowsill, you ran it at least 4 different ways. Does that sound right?
Yes, that sounds right.
Yeah, let me see if I got the 4 ways, but I'm going to ask you for an explanation. You ran the DNA assuming that there was only one contributor to that mix. Is that right?
No, that's incorrect.
Okay. You ran it assuming that there were 2 contributors.
Yes, in some runs.
And you ran it assuming, then you ran it again, this data, through your computer system, assuming that there were a mixture of 3 people in the DNA sample.
That's correct.
And again, when I say DNA sample, I'm referring only to the window frame DNA that's in your report.
Okay,
The
yes.
two-page report. Okay. You also ran it assuming that there was a mixture of 4 persons' DNA.
That's correct, yes.
Did you do any higher than that?
We did not. I did not.
Okay. And when you ran it assuming that there was a mixture of 2 people, what was your result?
Referring to the match table in the case packet, we got a similar result. It was a number in the hundreds of millions.
And when you ran it assuming that there were 4 people, what was the result?
Again, the number, just looking at the results, the number would have been in the millions for the match between the window frame and the defendant.
What page shows that?
This is page 127.
So, doesn't your report reflect that when you ran it for 2 people, it could have been 1, Mr. Coons, or 2, Jhoselin Artega, but not both?
It would have been both of them. So there in the report, we do have a match statistic to both the victim as well as the defendant. And running it as 2 contributors, we see that both people are included or have inclusionary match statistics to that sample.
Where does it state that in that preliminary report, please? I'm sorry, your case packet. That's the analysis.
It would be in the match table on page 127, and basically separating out the 2 contributors, they kind of overlap, but you're still seeing those match statistics to both the victim, which is the column 2904, and the defendant, which is column 71-01.
Basically overlap. What does that mean?
So they have equal parts of, they both contributed equal amounts of DNA, so looking at the signals, they might be equal, and so trying out different possibilities. The computer's like, okay, I don't really know which one goes with which, so it's trying out the different combinations that explain that data.
So it could have been one but not the other, because you'd have to take, again, in my Scrabble example, you'd have to take a few letters from Coons and slide it over to Artega, and that would leave some letters missing from Coons, right?
No, because the data can overlap. And we actually ran it assuming that Mr. Coons was present and saying who else is left over, as well as running it a separate way, saying, all right, assume that the victim is present, who's left over. And in both of those cases, it was always the other one that was present.
So is your report that there was both Ms. Artega's DNA on the window frame and Mr. Coons' DNA on the window frame?
Yes, that would be a good summary of the results we found.
But wasn't there also some left over for a potential 3rd person on the window frame?
Yes, there was at least 3 contributors in that data, so there is a possible 3rd unidentified person.
And is there no way to identify that 3rd person from the testing methods that you have?
To produce a match statistic, you would need to compare it to a reference sample. So if we had that reference to compare to, we could say if they were included or not. But there is, until we have that reference, we can't really say if that person is included or not.
But you're pretty confident from the data that you ran that there were 3 contributors on that sample.
Reviewing the data, there's at least 3 contributors present in the sample.
If there are 3 contributors in that sample, how can you get such a high number for only showing 2? Wouldn't that 3rd sample somehow skew or alleviate some of those other peaks?
So what can happen is this 3rd person is more of a minor contributor, so it's those lower level peaks. So what's been shown in a study that I'm actually a part of is once you assume at least enough contributors, you'll see all 3 of those people, But if you assume less, you might, restrict that inference, and it may not be the best result to go off of. It's reviewing the data and saying, okay, there's at least 3. Let's look at the results, assuming at least 3 contributors.
So when you put that information in your computer system, that is just a blind assumption that you're making.
It's based upon reviewing the data. So I and like an analyst at a crime laboratory would review the data kind of, one way is to count up the peaks and say, okay, I see, if there's one person, maybe there'd be a maximum of 2 peaks at a location. If there was 2 people, there'd be a maximum of 4 peaks at a location. If there was 3, there could be a maximum of 6 peaks. And kind of just looking at the data using training and experience to come up with what appears to be what's present in the data based on looking at it. There could be other contributors that are masked or too low or didn't amplify, but we can kind of get a good guess of at least how many people are there.
So it's a guess.
It's not a guess. It's an informed review of the data, much like any crime laboratory analyst would do when they also would make a similar conclusion, just looking at that data.
But when you put the information in your computer, when you say, all right, I'm going to assume that there's 2, and here's what my results show. And I'm going to assume that there's 3 contributors, here's what my results show, etc. Whether there's 2, 3, or 4, when you ran it that way, again, you don't know if there's only 2, you don't know if there's only 3, you don't know if there's only 4, right?
That's correct, and that's why we ran it under multiple conditions to test it out and say, okay, if there's 4 people, am I still seeing those 2 or the inclusionary statistics to the 2 references that I saw before?
And so the one that you chose to put in your report was assuming there were 3 contributors.
That's correct. It was from one of the 3 contributor runs.
Because that was the highest number you saw when you ran it that way that linked it to Mr. Coons.
No, that's based on reviewing the data. There was at least 3 contributors, and from that set, I chose a number that was in the middle, or kind of the average, or the representative value to put in the report.
So when you ran it with assuming 4 contributors, did it show a greater link to Mr. Coons?
It did not, but it was a number. It would have been in the millions or hundreds of millions.
When you showed it with only 2 contributors, did it show a greater link to Mr. Coons?
No, it was also a number in the hundreds of millions.
So my question before was, what you included in your report was the highest link that you could possibly get to Mr. Coons when you made those assumptions?
It was a number in the middle, or a representative value.
Well, how can it be in the middle if 4 and 2 are less?
They're the same. The 2s were in the hundreds of millions as well, those match statistics. And there was also some in the hundreds of millions for the 4 contributor runs as well.
The third person's DNA in this, was it male or female?
I wouldn't be able to, I don't have that information on me, but based on probably the data, it could be either. It would be a 50-50.
In your report from all the other items you listed from page 7 of that case packet, but for the cigarette butt, everything else that you tested, ran numbers on, not really tested, I guess. Do you call it testing, or what do you call it?
You can call it testing. You can call it like the statistical testing, or
You're not
just
doing chemicals, right?
Correct. We're not doing the actual chemical testing.
Everything else that you ran the numbers on through your computer system, but for the cigarette butt, excluded Mr. Coons.
That's correct. There were exclusionary match statistics. That would have been, the results would have been exclusionary, yes.
But you did find inclusion of a person's DNA from the samples that you had, correct?
Yes, the victim was present on a lot of the samples, and some of the family members were present as well.
Which family members?
I'm on page 44. It would have been J. Artega, which was item 30-02, as well as possibility of her, the item 31, which is Oscar Artega, and then possibility of, I believe it's the father and the mothers, M. Artega and P. Velasquez.
Were there any other items besides the window frame where there was also unknown DNA found?
Yes, there would have been, most of the items were mixtures, and in some of the items, there was only maybe the victim found, for example.
Were there other mixtures where there was DNA found that was not identified to anybody that you tested against?
Yes, there would have been some samples.
Which ones were those?
One was the outside window frame, but based on reviewing my preliminary notes, there was little informative data for that, so the data wasn't really useful for that item.
Does that mean that there was unknown DNA out there, but you just couldn't do anything further based on the data you were given?
Correct. There could have been unknown DNA there.
Okay, what's the next?
That looks like it for where we didn't have a match to the victim, but the other items where we only had the match to the victim, there's a possibility of at least one or two other contributors for most of those items.
So there were some where there was a mixture that you identified positively included Jhoselin Artega, but also there was other DNA of persons unknown.
Correct.
Would that have included on the karate belt?
Yes, it would have been possible for the karate belt items, yes.
And is your understanding that the karate belt was potentially the murder weapon in this case?
I might have known that could have been what I don't know if that was what the murder weapon was, but I think we were told that it was used.
And that has an unknown person.
Yes.
I want to ask you just briefly about transfer, DNA transfer. Well, no, before we get that, I want to talk about degradation. You mentioned that your laboratory has done work on the World Trade Center.
That's
remains, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Just because this is a record, I know everybody knows, but that would have been September 11th, 2001.
Yes.
And your laboratory is still in that process, is that correct?
And I think it was in 2006, Cybergenetics was contacted by the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner from New York City to help to identify some of the victim remains, a lot of which were, badly damaged DNA, and then associate them with either family members or personal effects. And then, those results were written up and sent back to the OCME.
So was that report, your work was completed in 06, or is it still ongoing?
It's not still ongoing. The results were sent back to the New York Office of the Chief Medical Examiner.
Okay, so that would have been 5 years after that attack, and those people were killed. Your laboratory was still doing testing on that. Did the report, sent it back to New York, I assume?
Yes.
What's the oldest human DNA that, in your training experience, that's been tested? Successful.
I believe they've done some things with, I'm not really sure. I know they've done some things with like woolly mammoth DNA, and they're trying to do applications like that. But I'm not specifically know the exact human DNA application.
Well, have they not done DNA testing on, for example, mummies, Egyptian
Oh,
mummies?
yes, they have.
And that's between 2,000 and 7,000 years old?
Yeah, that would be a fair statement, yes.
And also the mummies in the Andes in South America also got older?
Yes.
And in those tests, they've been able to recover full strands of DNA?
Yes, because of the way that the mummies were preserved, or they were preserved very well.
So it's not unlikely that DNA could be left, for example, in a mobile home that's air-conditioned, 4 walls and a roof over it, and it'd still be there 2 years later?
It's possible, yes.
Just as it was possible for your company to get DNA from remains that had been under building rubble for 5 years?
Correct. It's my understanding that a lot of the DNA may have been produced before then, but the lab had issues interpreting it or associating it with the missing people.
But you were able to do that successfully?
Yes.
And the conditions are not dispositive of whether you would expect to find DNA years later, but it certainly helps if it's in a protected location.
Yes.
And it would certainly help if those DNA samples hadn't been subjected to things like cleaning chemicals.
That's correct. If it were just an undisturbed, cooler area, the DNA could persist or be there years later.
And things like skin cells certainly can get into circulation systems in homes.
Yes, it's possible.
They can be redistributed throughout a location if they're sucked into a heating air unit, blown out of vent somewhere on the other end.
If there's enough DNA, yes.
And if you saw a very small amount of DNA sample, that might indicate to you that it was either old or degraded.
Or just the person isn't a good shedder, they just don't leave a lot of DNA behind.
Let me ask you about shedding. I think you brought that up. So if someone has a skin condition, for example, where they excessively shed, would you be expecting to find more of that DNA in that location where they were excessively shedding versus a person who doesn't have a skin condition?
It would depend on other factors, as if did they touch an item, were they wearing longer sleeves or shorter sleeves? There's a lot of factors that go behind the amount of DNA that's deposited. But if you do have a condition like that, certainly, you could possibly leave more DNA behind.
And when you do the DNA testing, when that testing is performed, are you looking also to try to identify the source of the bodily fluid or skin that deposited that DNA application?
We don't do that using the computer, but the crime laboratory has tests that they can do to test for saliva and blood and kind of get a presumptive or confirmatory saying, okay, this is definitely blood, or it could be blood, or maybe it's saliva.
And you can also get DNA from sweat. Is that accurate?
Correct. Any bodily fluid from skin cells, pretty much any hair roots, pretty much anything that, you could get out of your body.
What is the smallest nanogram amount you think you could get a DNA sample from?
They've shown to get DNA from, I believe it's the minimum is like 6 cells or something like that. There may not be the most informative DNA data, but most studies will show it's 100 picograms, or I think it's 0.1 nanograms. That's usually like where you start losing some of the information in the data.
All right, and for those of us who didn't do well in chemistry, can you take a nanogram on how much is a nanogram?
It's so there's like 9 zeros in front of the 1, I believe. So it's a very, very small number. So like 0.0000001.
It's a nanogram is a tiny percentage of a fraction of a gram.
Yes.
Now I can go from a gram up, so would you agree with me that there's a little over 28 grams in an ounce?
I wasn't that good at, conversions, but sure.
Approximately.
Yes.
Okay. So the nanogram is a fraction of 1/28 of 1 ounce.
Yes.
I'm sorry, how many zeros did you say was in front of that number?
I believe 9, so like it's
9.
0.00001.
Okay, so there's 9 zeros in the middle one. And how many nanograms do you need to get a sample?
Most labs will prefer to have at least 0.1 nanograms for getting a good sample, but we've shown in studies you can see DNA in less of a sample than that. But it may not be as complete of a profile.
And this may be outside your expertise, and if it is, just let me know. Can you see 1 nanogram, or is that something with your naked eye you'd be able to see?
But probably not, no.
Would you have trouble with a microscope seeing that?
Probably also, yes. Especially for DNA. It's a very, very, very small molecule.
So we're talking about, it could be a microscopic amount of DNA.
Yes.
Is there anything in this report, or the data that you received when you did your report, that indicated what kind of source the DNA was, whether it was bodily fluid, hair, skin, any of that?
I don't believe we had any of that information. We just kind of had what the item number was and then what they called the sample. So I didn't have the information from the crime laboratory about that.
So Hornyak, I think those are all my questions. I hope you have a nice trip this week.
One brief follow-up. Ms. Hornyak, and I don't know if you can or not, but on that sample that you examined on the window, is there any determination about the percentages of DNA between, not probability, but the amount or the strength of that DNA sample between Ms. Ortega, the victim, and the defendant, Roy Coons?
Yes, so as part of the true allele process, true allele, instead of just figuring out those allele pairs, it can also figure out the amounts of each of those contributors present. And so based on the run that was reported, the victim's DNA was about 40% of the sample, and the defendant's would have been about 35% of that sample, of whatever that total would have been that the crime laboratory would be able to tell you. And so then there'd be about 15% of somebody else, or yes, something like that.
Thank you.
Recross.
So, Ms. Hornyak, what accounts for that percentage? What accounts for that percentage difference?
It's based on those patterns that are proposed against the data, and so the computer can figure out the amounts over the heights of those boxes to when it's figuring out that pattern.
That was the scientific answer. I was asking for something more basic, my fault. Let me ask a better question. So why was there only 35% of one, 40% of the other, and 15% of the other? What, is there any way you can tell scientifically why that was? It was only those percentages? Not that they existed, but for example, was one fresher than the other? Was one older than the other?
I wouldn't be able to tell you how or when the DNA was deposited. So it would just be based on that data, those are the percentages that were separated out. And it would have been 40, 35, and 25. I couldn't do math there for a second.
And there's no way to age DNA then, is what you're saying?
Not using this analysis, no.
So the 35% could have been that day, 40% could have been a year ago.
It could have been, it's possible, yes.
Thank you.
Anything further?
No, Your Honor.
All right, thank you.
Thank
Here's
you.
Peter. Who's your next witness?
Next witness, Your Honor, would be Jhoselin Artega.
All right.
And Your Honor, due to the fact that she's a minor, we're requesting that, I believe that the video will not be.
Okay, well, you're gonna have to cut off the camera, not on her. You can put it on the examiner, but not on the witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. If you would, just take a deep breath and in a loud voice, would you introduce yourself to the jury and tell them your first and last name and spell both of those, please?
Hello, my name is Jhoselin Artega, Jhoselin, and my last name is Arteaga.
Ms. Artega, how old are you now?
I'm 15.
And I'm not going to ask you where you're in school, but are you presently enrolled in school?
Yes, ma'am.
What grade are you in?
I am 10th, going to 11th grade.
Ms. Artega, I just want to ask you a few general questions about when you were living over in the trailer in Lot C2 at 1229 Dickerson Pike. Are you familiar? Remember that?
Yes.
Who did you live there with?
I lived there with my mom, my brother, and my sister.
Would you, on occasion, visit your father, or would he come over and visit you?
Yes, ma'am.
And what's his name?
Marlon Artega.
Specifically, did your mom have any type of rules about when and how you could go outside of the trailer?
Yes.
Could you just explain that to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury?
Well, we had many rules concerning that we weren't really accustomed to the area. One was we could not go outside. Another one was we could not look outside the windows. We could not be loud. We could not, basically that was it. Just be safe around and yeah.
Were you allowed to play outside if there was an adult there, your mother or your father, to supervise you?
Yes.
And primarily, other than at home, where would you and your sister and brother spend your time?
We would go to church. We would go to my grandma's house. We would go with my dad to eat and things like that, park, or we would just be around the neighborhood with my mom.
Specifically, did you and your siblings have any kind of sports activities you did?
Well, not inside school because we mostly focus on studying, but outside we would play together, maybe soccer, just a little basketball, and just our bicycles. Yeah.
Did you ever take lessons in Taekwondo or karate?
Yes.
Which one was it?
Taekwondo.
Okay. And specifically, who had the highest belt?
Me. Yeah.
What belt did you have?
If I can remember correctly, I think I was at first rank blue belt. Yeah.
And is it an accomplishment every time you move from one color up to the next color?
Yes, it is.
And what does the tape on the end of a Taekwondo belt signify?
It signifies various things depending on the color. If you passed the steps on sparring, you get a tape. If you remember all of the kicks and steps and everything like that, you would get another one, depending on the accomplishments you've done in that one belt.
Now, when you would be doing Taekwondo, there's something that's called doing a pattern. Is that correct?
Yes.
And could you describe what a pattern is?
A pattern is something signifying that one belt, that every belt has a pattern. So if you master that pattern, you would get a tape signifying that you could show it in front of the people when you're trying to go to a new belt. So, yeah.
And what's the difference between that and sparring? What is sparring?
Sparring is basic fighting, kicking. It's practice with one of your members, and it's just practicing all of the different kicks and the different kicks and punches that you would do, but safely.
In other words, you're not hitting with full force.
Not hitting, yeah, if not, we would get in trouble.
Yeah, you get in trouble if you hit too hard,
Yes,
right?
yes.
And specifically, when you are doing sparring in Taekwondo, do you have a uniform that you wear?
Mm-hmm.
And is the belt a part of that uniform?
Yes.
So would you, in fact, be wearing a belt when you're sparring and coming in contact with your fellow students?
Yes.
And since it's an accomplishment, when you move from one color or level to the next one, are those belts something that you keep? It's kind of almost like a trophy type
Yes,
of
always.
situation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And was that something that you and your family did as well?
Yes.
Now, Ms. Artega, I want to ask you a little bit about your room.
Mm-hmm.
Were you good at keeping your room clean?
No.
Okay. Can you kind of describe, and ladies and gentlemen of the jury will get to see pictures later, but can you kind of describe what your bedroom looked like?
The messiest bedroom you would ever see. There was clothes everywhere. You could not step anywhere without something being below you. The closets were horrible. Yeah.
Did your mom get on to you a lot for that?
Always, always.
Okay. Now, tell me about, as far as the bed, would there be occasions where you would be on the bed and not have the sheets on?
There would be occasions when we didn't want to put the sheets on.
When you didn't want to make your bed?
Yeah.
What would you and your sister do then? If you were going to sleep and you didn't have your sheets on your bed?
Just go to sleep. Yeah.
Would you use the blanket just on top of you?
Yeah.
Okay. And was there anything in particular that your sister liked to snack on?
Cheetos, chips, any type of snack that she could get her hands on.
Now, there was a time before this terrible day that I believe you and your sister went roller skating.
Yes.
Is that correct? Where were you at the time?
If I could remember, I think it was the roller skating rink near Rivergate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Who all went that time?
It was just my family, my mom, me, and my brother.
And did your sister get injured somehow?
Yes, she did.
How did she get injured?
Someone accidentally pushed her while she was trying to roller skate, and so she fell on her knee. Oh, not her knee. Yeah, her foot.
Her foot?
Mm-hmm.
And as a result of that, did she have to use like an ace bandage and some
Yes.
crutches?
Yes.
During the time that you would be home alone with your sister or your brother, did you ever allow Mr. Roy Coons to come inside the trailer?
Never.
Did you or your brother and sister in your presence ever hang out and laugh and shake hands with Roy Coons?
Never.
In what kind of situation would you ever see Mr. Coons?
When he was outside, usually it was always outside. when my mom would talk to him about mowing our yard, things like that, yeah.
Was he someone that you would go up and have conversations with or talk to?
No.
Thank you, Ms. Artega.
Cross.
Ms. Artega, on these occasions when you saw Mr. Coons outside, did you ever notice him smoking cigarettes?
I'm not sure. I don't remember.
That's all.
Judge, I have one follow-up, I apologize. If we could have Exhibit 4, the 911 recording, handed to Ms. Ortega.
If we'll stipulate those are revisions.
All right.
Thank you, Your Honor. That's all we wish to do, is just to authenticate her voice.
Okay, that's fine. Anything further?
No, Your Honor.
Thank you, ma'am. You may step down. Next witness.
Your Honor, next witness, we need a very brief consultation with the court over whether or not a photograph would be appropriate.
Okay, let's step back.